This lesson will be using the base that we've made in the previous lesson to explore some of the aesthetics and the general art direction of your mech. A specific thing I want to talk about is how to think about really detailing your mech, what shapes to take, how to really execute the details and the mechanics. One of the ways to look at it is to think similarly to how a story writer would think about world building. There's many ways you can think about how to detail a mech or how to really draw any kind of object, any design. You'll hear a lot of people talk about shape language, the idea that you can give an identity to an object by choosing whether or not it has, for example, very rounded shapes, whether it has very angular shapes. And this is absolutely a valid way, and you will have to think about this on every design. But to expand a bit on that general concept on what kind of guidelines do you want to use for your design, I want to expand by kind of describing it like a sort of world building for your design. Now, obviously, we can't write an entire world building document for every single design we want to do. So a simplistic way of looking at it is to kind of think of an ethos that your design is going to fit in. This could be something like the kind of general aesthetic and vibe of, for example, World War I vehicles. You can take ideas of that era, ideas of that kind of technology, and you can start describing that as a sort of ethos that an object could live in. You can find then both elements like how technology was expressing itself in that era, what aesthetics or non-aesthetics would be considered in that kind of time period, and you can think a bit about the kind of spirit that the design would be created in. For example, for a World War I vehicle, the kind of spirit it would be created in would be that it would be in dire times, it would fulfill a sort of necessity, and it was such an early point in technology, especially when you look at, for example, tanks, that they weren't very sophisticated, and they were often very experimental, sometimes even, in hindsight, very dumb design-wise. For technology, you see that there's a lot of kind of primitive ideas. There's very early ideas of diesel engines starting to be used. You can see that the kind of way that they work with metal is very rudimentary. And for aesthetics, for example, you can see that there would be very little consideration for aesthetic in those kind of vehicles. They were built very much for function. They were often built in a very short time period with very stretched resources. So there would be no idea of aesthetics. So that's an example of a kind of general ethos you can think about. You don't have to think necessarily about a super unique sci-fi world. You don't have to necessarily think about the entire world building that you would want to accompany your design, but it can really help to have a general sense of what kind of ideas underpin your design. And then you can use that to inform how you're going to then execute and what kind of decisions you want to make. So as an exercise, the best way to start with this is to try and assemble some ref boards. You're trying to essentially find an overall aesthetic and sets of images that all kind of work towards a sort of cohesive feeling of place or a feeling of design. The first ref board I did is going more towards the diesel punk direction, looking at some 30s to 50s era vehicles and technology. I've specifically pursued the feeling of retro that you get from some of these references. I was also specifically looking for references that show some of the outdated nature of the technology of that era. For example, the vehicle with the crane in the reference clearly shows a more pared back and primitive version of this technology, not necessarily the most state-of-the-art or nicely executed version that would have been available at that time. I've also specifically cherry-picked these references to include the more rounded shapes that were being achieved at that time from using things like pressed metal. There's references of the same era that would show you a more squared-off design style, but I've specifically chosen to pick the rounded ones to get a more specific aesthetic out of it. You want to take your time finding a lot of references, and you want to start filtering them down efficiently. You don't just want to take a bunch of random pictures immediately. You would want to take pictures and spend a bit of time thinking about why you want these pictures, what exactly you like about it, and try and think critically about whether all the pictures can really fit together. In selecting these pictures, you also want to think a bit of utility. You want to have a mixture of pictures that show you the general spirit of what you're trying to get at, but you would also want to make sure that a decent proportion of these references will be useful for your specific design process. This means the references should be applicable to your mech. For example, some technological and mechanical references, preferably some isolated photos or close-ups of mechanics, of engines, of cables, if there's cables in the kind of aesthetic you want to do. And some general things that will describe how, for example, an outer shell would be built, like, for example, the plating that a military vehicle would use, or the kind of like outer shell of a car or outer shell of a boat. These are kind of some of the elements that you would really want to make sure in your references, because they will be helpful when you actually approach those very specific parts of your design. But bear in mind that the goal of these references is to find a general style. While utility should be represented, don't see this as finding references just to solve very specific technical problems. These are to find a general aesthetic that will inform all of your decisions later on. A contrasting ref board I have done is this one. So my selection of references here is going in a very different direction. It is a lot more aesthetic. It's a lot more modern. I'm specifically going in a kind of direction of sharper aerodynamic shapes and a very kind of modern, cleaner aesthetic. So it doesn't always have to be that you pick an exact time frame. It's a good example to think of a time frame, but you don't always have to pick a historic era. It can also just be a general aesthetic of design that you find. You might find like specific product designers all working in a very similar direction. What I've then done is I've taken the build-up that we did in the previous class, and I've used this as a base to take these ref boards and try and filter them towards filling in this block out. I will start off by showing you the fully rendered examples, which I've taken to a pretty far level of finish just to demonstrate how different they can be and what the kind of end result of this could look like. You can see that some of the shapes that you see in the cars, I took direct inspiration from, and then I used those for the body to have similar ideas of rounded stamped metal. I've looked a lot at the mechanical parts, having still rivets and a lot of like very square blocks and more rudimentary, which I've then used to fill out some of the mechanical parts. And I've used a specific reference of this operator crane, this for cinema, is actually used for cameras, to kind of inform me how something like a between part like this could be, like where his arm connects to the shoulder, how that could be filled out. You also see that I used the same kind of way that the pistons look in that reference to kind of inspire, and you see that the energy kind of battery block that I had at the back of the arm, I replaced with a diesel engine with some exposed mechanics, because the exposed mechanics and the grunginess is part of the aesthetic I like about it. So I'm trying to specifically take that from it. Then, as a counterpoint, on the other ref board, this is the result that I come up with. You can see here I've taken a very, very different approach, which is the real thing I want to point out with these, is just how different it can be based on what kind of ref board you choose to go with. You can see here that I've been a lot cleaner with the shapes. There's a lot less noise in the shapes, since this kind of design aesthetic would want to reduce a lot of this noise. You see that I've taken some of the like sharp, angular aerodynamic shapes as inspiration. You see that I've cleaned up some of the mechanics. And I've taken direct inspiration from some of the engine parts that I've seen, where it has specific ways of having bracing structures and breakup that I've then copied. So another thing I want to point out for that is how to do this process. So for doing this process, you kind of want to take your ref board. You kind of have to take your time to look at it, because it's not easy to immediately transfer this ref board into your mech. But what you want to do is you want to kind of cherry pick elements that you think work really well. So you want to cherry pick things that to you evoke the feeling of that ethos, and you want to then try and find as many ways to use it as you can. Examples of that is the kind of mechanical breakdowns I've done. These kind of stamped bracing structures that are used in between spaces. I've deliberately picked those out, and I've used those in as many places in the mechanics as I could. I've used some of the fronts of the bike parts to specifically inspire the front and the main shell. Same with that cut here. That cut here is also based on one of the references directly. And those are the really big elements I used. And then I also used this kind of vent from this specific reference on the ref board. And I've tried to proliferate that at different places as a good graphic element. And then as a sort of warning I also want to give with this is that when you start doing this, there's a certain danger that can happen that you will take things from the ref board directly into your mech without necessarily thinking whether it would make sense for the object. You want to make sure that your details still make sense for the object you're designing, and don't look like you've taken something that only makes sense for a very specific object and then just transposed it on another. As a task for this lesson, I would like you to assemble 2 ref boards, each targeting a distinctly different ethos, and then using your base from the previous lesson, make a drawing for each, which will incorporate elements of the respective ref board. This by no means has to be as detailed as the versions I've shown here, which are more as a showcase of the end result than representative examples of what I'm expecting for this class. It can be challenging to immediately find all of these aesthetic details and draw them in one pass at one go. So to make it easier, you can do similarly to what we did in the previous class. You can take separate elements of the mech and then in isolation do a few sketches exploring what you want to do with it.